Is water really wet as they say? Nah, don't believe what Big Hydro tells you. It's actually the texture of wood until it touches your hand. Come to think of it, I've only heard them say things like, it's wet, or there's a lot of water down there. No one's ever made a one-to-one connection, it's always implied. Only if you engage in foreplay first. Depends entirely on your definition of wet. I'd say water can make solid objects wet, but water itself is not wet. Others say that anything that contains water is wet, therefore water itself is wet. Depends on the region. Yes, water defines wetness, so it's exactly as wet as they say. Water is only wet when it becomes saturated with itself. It's wet, in comparison to a hydrophobic material or powder like my protein powder is. No, not very. The human body has no wet center, so we'll never know. As many other thing the human brain figures out if we feel wet based on other things and assumptions. Which is why we get it wrong sometimes, i.e. cold laundry from the dryer that's been dry for a day. We expect it to be warm, and it's not, so our brain tricks us into thinking it's wet just because it's cold. If you're normal and mentally well-adjusted, yes, it's wet. If you're a pretentious, obnoxious, actually attention whore, perhaps it's not. Depends on who's saying what, I suppose. Pour a bottle of water over your head and find out, lol. No, water makes things wet. Depends, is it just water? Or has it been mixed with water wetter? Water where water is much wetter than water. About 70% of fresh water is not wet as it is in solid form. So no, water is not always as wet as they say, https. The truth is no, anyone who says otherwise just doesn't have much critical thinking. Water makes things wet. Now, here's an equal question just to prove how obvious this is fire burnt? Or does it make things burnt? Water isn't wet. It's like saying am all covered water or am all wet. Note the difference. You can make an infinite amount of arguments for and against this, but I'll just say that in chemistry we work with the term wetting. Wetting describes the ability of a liquid to maintain contact with a solid surface. As water isn't a solid surface, it cannot experience being wet. It's not, but people will argue that something can saturate itself. Water makes things wet, but it's debatable whether water itself is wet. Water isn't wet. If something gets water on it, it is then wet. Yes, but not the Kirkland stuff, that stuff is dusty as fuck. To people saying water is not wet, it just makes things wet. Fire makes things hot. Is fire not hot?